Hello friends. Today we want to take a look at the fourth sign Jesus performed in the Gospel of John, the feeding of the 5,000 with just a little lad's sack lunch. I want to begin by reading the text. Then I want to discuss a few of the features of this sign that interest me. I hope they interest you as well. And after that I want to talk briefly about the conversation that followed this sign between Jesus and the people, and what this sign tells us about Jesus, His character, and His ministry. And then finally, I want to consider how this sign and Jesus' subsequent conversation with the people might apply to us. Now, I know that I have not necessarily said anything that might encourage you to stay with me to the end of this message, unless it is that you might just be intrigued by this miracle. But I hope you will stay with me to the end of the message. I don't want you to miss the application of this message. Now, let's read the account of this sign together, and it's found in John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd kept following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now, the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Now gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." But when Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. All right, there's our interesting story. I want to share with you a few features of this sign that really interest me. First of all, did you know that this is the only miracle recorded by all 4 gospel writers? It's found in Matthew 14, Mark 6, Luke 9, and here in John 6. And that may speak to the importance of this sign, don't you think? It may have been a pivotal point in Jesus' ministry that tells us so much about his character and his ministry, as well as how we should respond to him. Second, it's obvious that Jesus uses this occasion of the hungry masses to test one of the disciples, Philip. The text tells us that when Jesus looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" And then verse 6 says, he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. As we might expect, Philip fails the test when he replies, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. Clearly, neither Philip nor Andrew, another disciple, had any inkling of what Jesus is about to do. It appears that even those closest to Jesus had very little faith that Jesus could satisfy the needs of this hungry crowd. And when you think about this, it's ironic, isn't it? After all, these people surely knew of Jesus turning water into wine. healing the nobleman's dying son, and healing the lame man by the pool, not to mention other miracles that they saw Jesus perform. A striking feature of this gospel is that with rare exception, such as the confession of Peter at the end of John chapter 6, the 12 come off rather more like the dirty dozen than the illustrious and illuminated inner circle. They seem slow-witted when it comes to recognizing Jesus' power and identity. Perhaps that should encourage us to exercise patience with those for whom faith in God comes slowly, or for whom it is problematic. Or perhaps this is a challenge to each of us to not be like the 12. Another interesting feature of this sign for me that I want to mention is that after Jesus performed this compassionate act of feeding these hungry people, all with just 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, the text tells us that after they all were satisfied and their bellies full, 12 baskets of leftovers were taken up. I could say that this proves the lesson, waste not, want not. But I would rather point out the fact that the astounding outcome of this miracle is that after eating their fill, there was more leftover bread than when Jesus started. Now, let's talk very briefly about what this sign tells us about Jesus. First of all, I'm afraid that what I'm about to say will come across as a broken record, and many of you don't even understand that idiom, I'm guessing, since music is no longer placed on vinyl records. But what I want to add here is that once again, this sign shows Jesus' power and compassion. We have made this very point in the first 3 signs in John's Gospel, Jesus' power and compassion. Note his compassion. He cared. He really cared that a hungry crowd was following him, and he either felt obligated or the desire to do what he could to help them. And note his power. That's right, he took a boy's lunch of 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, and after giving thanks, multiplied that lunch into enough food to feed 5,000 people. Great power. But I think there is a still deeper meaning to this sign, don't you? The ensuing conversation with the people seems to bring out the deeper meaning of the sign. For you see, after the sign, later the people found Jesus on the other side of the sea, and this is where Jesus told them, "You are looking for me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves." Then he said, "Don't work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For it is on him that God the Father has set his seal." John 6 and verse 27. That leads Jesus to a conversation about the manna of the Old Testament. The manna. You may recall that God provided bread for ancient Israel as they wandered in the wilderness, and that bread was called manna. Jesus told the people that it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. The people respond, "Sir, give us this bread always." And what was Jesus' reply? "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Chapter 6 and verse 35. Now, you Bible scholars among us may know that just as there are 7 signs in the Gospel of John, there are 7 I am statements. And this is the first one. Jesus declares, "I am the bread of life." He makes this declaration in verse 35 and makes it again a second time in verse 48. And then a third time he states, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." Verse 51. Doesn't it seem that having mentioned this about his nature 3 times, Jesus does not want his hearers to miss the point? And what is the point? Before I give you my answer to that question, let's consider the close parallel in John chapter 4. There, Jesus is talking with a woman by a well. She came there to fetch water, but Jesus offers her living water. He says to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water," that is from the well, "will be thirsty again. But those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life." Chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. Life-giving water in chapter 4 and life-giving bread in chapter 6. These are the things that Jesus offers people. Say, aren't bread and water the two fundamental and universal symbols of the sources of life? We need bread and we need water. So when Jesus says, "I am the bread of life," soon after the sign of turning 5 loaves of bread into enough food to feed 5,000 people, what might be the deeper meaning of this sign? Could it be that Jesus is the one who provides the true bread that gives life, that Jesus provides food that endures to eternal life, that true bread is found only in Him, that in our search for real life we must come to Him to find it, that He is the one and the only one who provides what we are truly looking for? The real meaning of the sign then, and the issue in chapter 6 is, who provides eternal life, and where can one obtain it? It's Jesus who provides life, and we obtain it by coming to Him. You see, the physical sign of feeding 5,000 people was intended to be seen as a window on a larger truth. Yes, true bread, true sustenance, true life is to be found only in Jesus, and not in the material signs that He performs. Now, let's talk about application. What lessons might we learn from this sign and the subsequent conversation that Jesus had with the people? First of all, this lesson is clear to me. Jesus is the source of true sustenance, true life. I know that I made this point earlier in our discussion of an earlier sign, but I think it bears repeating. Are you looking for life, that which will bring you real life? I think what this text says to us is that it's found in Jesus. Life is found in Jesus, in a relationship with Him. Simon Peter's response to Jesus in this very chapter makes this point. After many disciples turned back from following Jesus, He turned to the 12 and asked them, "Do you also wish to go away?" By the way, I find it to be so interesting and refreshing that Jesus offers even the 12 a way out if they choose. He never coerces anyone to follow Him, and He didn't coerce these 12 to stay with Him. But anyway, I want you to notice Peter's response in verse 68 of this chapter. John chapter 6 and verse 68. Let me read it for us. Well, I'll start earlier than that. How about verse 67? Jesus turns to the 12. "Do you also wish to go away?" Simon Peter answered, "Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God." That's Peter's response. Yes, Jesus has the words of eternal life. Now, we all want life, don't we? But many of us don't know where to find it. Would you agree with that? And I fear that many folks are looking for life in all the wrong places. An interesting article caught my eye recently. It was written by a lady named Kathy Caprino. She identifies herself as a success coach, a writer, speaker, and leadership trainer. And the title of her article is The Top 10 Things People Want in Life But Can't Seem to Get. Isn't that an interesting title? And after seeing the list, I thought, well, just about every desire on this list is provided by Jesus. And here's the list. The top 10 things people want in life but can't seem to get. Number 1, happiness. 2, money. 3, freedom. 4, peace. Joy. Balance. Fulfillment. Confidence. Stability. Passion, as in the kind of passion that one might have for his or her work. You see why I say that most of those things on her list Jesus provides, maybe with the exception of money, although I've always had plenty of money to live on, so I guess Jesus provides everything on that list. I do think people have this common desire to experience real life, to flourish, to thrive, but they look in the wrong places for that kind of life. And I think this sign and this text shows us that the place to look for life is in a relationship with Jesus. But there's a second thing that I think we learn from this text that we can apply to our own lives, and that is this. Jesus is looking for real followers. Now you say, where does this application come from? Let's go back to chapter 6 and verse 26, where Jesus says to the people, "You are only following me to fill your bellies." These people are pursuing Jesus as the ultimate provider of a free lunch. In other words, their reason for pursuing Him was purely material and purely selfish. There was no spiritual seeking involved. Just here, let's state that Jesus wants real followers, not those who are merely after the loaves and the fish. This may really speak to us. For how many of us are only following Jesus for what we can get from Him? For how following Him will benefit us? Are we following Jesus for who He is, or merely for what He can give us? Jesus wants real followers. People who seek a real relationship with Him, a friendship with Him. Interestingly, Jesus is popular at this point in His ministry, but with this sign and the following dialogue in chapter 6, His popularity is about to wane. A large crowd was following Him because of the people. They saw the signs that He was doing for the sick. John chapter 6 and verse 2 states, but I want you to notice how the farther the dialogue proceeds in chapter 6, the more offensive Jesus' words became. The people, they wanted someone to meet their physical needs. Jesus could provide them, but that was not His true mission. The people wanted Jesus to become a political leader who would be dedicated to the overthrow of the Romans and the reestablishment of self-rule. But when they tried to take Him by force to make Him king, He withdrew to the mountain by Himself. Chapter 6, verse 15. Jesus didn't come to be a zealot Messiah. You will notice that as it begins to dawn on the people that Jesus did not come for these reasons, but to be a source of spiritual life, the people started leaving Him. The crowds began to disperse. When Jesus lets them know that if they wish to have eternal life, they will be required to swallow Him and His divine claims and His coming death, that just becomes too much for these pseudo-followers to stomach. And then John tells us that many of His disciples turned back and no longer went about with Him. Verse 66. Of course, there is a warning here for us, right? Are we true followers of Jesus? Are we pursuing Him for the right reasons? You know, we ourselves can pursue Jesus, or we can pursue religion in general, simply for the material benefits we can get out of it. For example, some have found it profitable to go to church in order to make business contacts or political connections. Some also attend a certain church simply for what they can get out of it rather than for what they can give. But here, Jesus is offering us a stern rebuke to this sort of self-seeking approach to following Him. Well, permit me to issue this call to action as we bring this lesson on the fourth sign to a close. There are two commitments I would like for each of us to make. Would you consider them with me? First of all, if you haven't decided for yourself to pursue Jesus, I hope you will make that decision. Decide to follow Him, to learn from Him, to accept His claims and His teachings. And the second commitment, let's decide that those of us who are followers of Jesus, it's a privilege, isn't it? Let's decide that we will never ever leave Him, never. Let's make the confession that Peter made when Jesus asked the 12 if they would leave Him as others had done. Peter confessed, and so should we. Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have come to believe and know that You are the Holy One of God. May God bless us as we try to keep these commitments and as we dedicate ourselves to following Jesus.